On the last episode, we began our journey into adding air conditioning to our 1989 Camaro by removing the engine bay airbox and inspecting the firewall for differences that would halt our progress. After noticing that the differences were limited to a missing bolt hole, we decided to dive right in and begin removing the dashboard. The dashboard needs to be removed for two reasons. First of all, the air conditioning wiring harness is very hard to reach, as it passes through the firewall behind the passenger side cylinder head. On top of this, it is also placed directly behind the internal airbox, meaning that the internal airbox must be removed as well. The second reason is to switch out the internal airbox, as the air conditioning airbox uses vacuum lines to activate the vent doors, whereas the factory airbox uses cables. It should be noted that if you wanted to install the proper dashboard ducting that would add vents on the left and right sides of the dashboard, now would be the time, although I would imagine this would require sourcing an entirely new dashboard. The process begins by removing the center console. To do this, I began by removing the radio and climate controls, and continued removing any screws I saw until the trim panels could be removed. I recommend doing this slowly, and to make sure that you keep your fasteners organized so that everything can go back together easily. Getting the console up and over the handbrake was the most difficult part, as the handle needs to be pulled really hard to make sure it's as close to vertical as possible. You can see in these shots I was referencing form posts frequently, and I recommend doing the same if you get stuck at any point, as a small amount of research can prevent a world of pain caused by breaking something. With the console out, we begin removing the dashboard by first removing the dash pad. Once removed, it is as straightforward as removing any fasteners you see. The speakers and their mounting brackets are removed next, followed by the defrost window ducting. The gauges did not need to be removed, however I elected to, and to make our lives easier, I first dropped the steering column by removing the two bolts securing it from underneath. Finally, there are 4 large nuts on the corners of the dashboard securing it to the car, and with everything removed, it can be slid backwards. The car's wiring harness and the ECU are secured to the back of the dashboard, so be careful when pulling it to prevent wires from getting damaged. With everything disconnected, the whole assembly can be slid right out the door. Before we remove the interior airbox, we must first drain the coolant, as the heater core is situated inside the airbox. To do this, there is a small drain valve on the bottom of the radiator. Unfortunately, these cars are not designed in a way to allow you to attach a small hose or anything to control the spill, and it results in a bit of a mess. Regardless, the procedure is quite painless so long as you're okay with getting coolant everywhere. With the coolant drained, the internal airbox can now be removed. To make the process easier, I suggest looking at the air conditioning airbox we will be installing later to get a better idea of where any fasteners are located. Once all the fasteners are removed, the next challenge is removing the heater hoses. Unfortunately, these are hard enough to reach, let alone film, without getting in the way. The process of removing them is a pain, but relatively straightforward. Loosen the hose clamp, then slide the hose off the heater core. The hoses on mine were particularly stubborn. However, a combination of prying with a flathead screwdriver and pulling eventually got the hose off. Now repeat the process for the second hose, which I had already removed prior to filming, and the box can easily be removed from the inside. As mentioned earlier, there are cables attached to the airbox that control the vent doors, so be careful when pulling it away, as these cables are more than likely tangled with the wiring somewhere. To continue our teardown, the radiator is removed next to allow access to install the condenser. We begin by removing the 4 bolts securing the top hole down to the core support. Then, move on to remove the radiator fan. The radiator fan is secured by 4 bolts, 1 in each corner. The top 2 are easily accessible from the engine bay. However, the bottom 2 that I removed off camera may require taking a bit of a bath in all of that coolant that we just spilled under the car. Once unfastened, the fan must be squeezed past the hoses to be removed. Be aware that there are several clips securing the fan wiring to the car, and these clips should be removed before you attempt to remove the fan. With the top radiator hold down out of the way, and the fan extracted, the clips securing the wiring to the fan housing can be removed, and the electrical connector can be disconnected. Next, all the hoses need to be disconnected from the radiator. This is a fairly rinse and repeat process. For each hose, loosen the hose clamp and gently pry the hose off of its connection. We did this for the overflow tank, the heater hose, as well as the upper and lower radiator hoses. Be aware that removing these hoses will likely cause more coolant to come rushing out, so have a drain pan at the ready to prevent a mess. Once all of the hoses have been disconnected, the radiator can carefully be lifted out of the engine bay and placed aside for now. The front X-brace was removed next to get better access to the radiator support area and hopefully facilitate installation. If your car still has the plastic cover filling the area around the hood latch, it must be removed first. It should be noted that at this time I was not yet sure how the condenser was going to mount, so I decided to remove anything that might get in the way. There are 2 bolts holding each of the metal bars in place, and once removed, they can be finagled past the hood latch support and out of the engine bay. Next to go are the 2 plastic air shroud pieces on either side of the core support. These help guide air through the empty space in front of the radiator when no air conditioning condenser is installed. With a condenser installed, however, they will not fit nor serve any purpose, and hence must be removed. They are held on by 3 Christmas tree style plastic clips on either side, and after attempting to be gentle with them, I resorted to hitting them from the backside with a hammer. This worked alright, although it took a long time to fully remove the clips, so I turned to a more destructive option. I hit the clips with the hammer from the back until the head of the clip protruded enough that I could fit a flathead screwdriver under it. Then used the hammer in combination with the screwdriver to chisel the head off of the clip. This worked fairly well, although there is no hope in reusing the clips afterwards. Now that the car is fully disassembled, it's time to start cleaning up the new parts and installing them. The first component to get the restoration treatment will be our internal airbox. This needs to be disassembled anyways to replace the heater core, and we'll take the opportunity to clean it up and replace some insulation. First, the outer airbox's casing can be removed by undoing the screws around the perimeter with a screwdriver. Once the 6 screws are removed, the cover can be easily removed, exposing the heater core and the different door mechanisms that serve to redirect air. I then tried to remove the other side of the casing. However, even with the screws removed, it seemed like there was something holding it in place, and seeing as it did not need to be removed for our purposes, I decided it was better to avoid the risk of breaking it and just leave it alone. The heater core tray is held to the airbox by 4 fasteners, 2 deep within the case and 2 easily accessible at the top. Unfortunately, because I was not able to separate the other side of the casing, removing the heater core tray involved a lot of squeezing and stretching before it eventually gave way. I found that pushing on the heater core pipes from the outside was an excellent way to get it out of its seat, but the casing needed to be flexed before it would slip all the way out. With the heater core out of the way, I wanted to address the flaking insulation on the air diverter doors. To begin with, I simply rubbed them with a plastic bristle brush. The foam insulation came off very easily, and actually turned out to be quite a satisfying process. Once the top side had been stripped, it was time to move on to the bottom and repeat the process. I then came back with a brass metal wire brush on a drill to try and remove as much foam as possible. This certainly helped get into the nooks and crannies. However, all in all, it admittedly didn't seem to do that much, and one could easily get away with just using a plastic brush. With the foam removed, the surfaces were scrubbed clean to remove any loose foam, and the pile of foam debris was quickly picked up with a vacuum so that new foam could be applied. I decided to use a cheap adhesive-backed foam from the craft store, and it should hopefully do a good enough, if not perfect job, of giving the metal doors a small amount of insulation. The foam was cut to size and pressed down to ensure it had good adhesion to the door, and any excess foam was trimmed using a razor blade. The process was then repeated for all of the doors. The foam which seals the internal airbox to the dashboard ducting was in good shape, however there were many places where the adhesive had failed and the foam was beginning to peel off the airbox. To address this, I went around the airbox with a hot glue gun to reattach any loose foam, which worked very well. The used heater core that was included with the air conditioning airbox appeared original, and if it hadn't leaked already, it was bound to soon, so it should really be replaced. To remove it from the tray, there are 2 clips holding onto the end tanks of the heater core secured with a total of 3 screws. The side with the hoses protruding has a claw-like clip that is removed with a single screw, and the other side has a flat band clip that passes along the entire length of the end tank, with a screw on either side. With the fasteners and the clips removed, the heater core can be easily lifted off the tray. With the old heater core removed and set aside, we can now see the foam strips which sit between the heater core and its tray. They are old and peeling, and we decided to replace them with the same adhesive-backed foam we used earlier. The strips were first gently removed and set aside, and the area was wiped down with a shop towel and some all-purpose cleaner to ensure the new foam would have good adhesion. Then, using the old foam as a template, new strips could be cut and stuck securely into place on both sides of the tray. Installing the new heater core onto the tray is the reverse of removal. However, because it is of a different design, the claw-style clip may need to be bent to fit the different geometry of the new style heater core. This heater core is actually the one I removed from my car, as it had been replaced recently anyways, so I saw no need to get a new one. With the heater core mounted to its tray, and everything cleaned, insulated, and repaired, the airbox can be put back together. I mistakenly first reinstalled the screws onto the side of the airbox that we never managed to separate. This made reinstalling the heater core tray quite difficult, and I ended up removing some of these screws again to allow me to flex the casing a little more. After a lot of bending, squeezing, flexing, and swearing, I eventually managed to get the heater core tray seated in the airbox. This would have been much easier if we had successfully torn down the box completely, but we managed to do it regardless. With the doors back in their positions, and all the screws we removed to get to this point put back, the heater core tray can be secured to the box using its 4 fasteners. Now, the other side of the casing, along with its screws, can be reattached, and the airbox is finally ready for installation into the car. In the next episode, we're going to be covering the complete process of wiring our AC system, as well as hooking up the vacuum line so that we can not only install the internal airbox, but make it functional. Things are really coming together now.